towards neighboring countries, above all women and children. Property damage is also severe and burdensome. Since the beginning of the hostilities, Mexico has insisted on the need for a diplomatic solution and responding to the humanitarian dimension of the conflict without subordinating it to political considerations in strict adherence to international humanitarian law. In this regard, we sponsored with France a draft resolution which was turned over to the General Assembly and gave rise to Resolution E11-2 adopted last March 24. Today, we reiterate that humanitarian assistance continues to be a priority which is indispensable. We have also, to the best of our ability, supported the mediation efforts of the Secretary General, and together with Norway, we drafted a presidential statement to this end, adopted last May 6. This statement is evidently not enough, but it is the only public expression that this Council has been able to make since the beginning of the conflict. The progress of the war, with its enormous human and material cost, and the increase of humanitarian needs due to the conflict, such as the dearth of humanitarian supplies and the high cost of fuel, facing winter, we urgently require a solution through diplomatic means and a ceasefire. For this, we need political will of the parties and commitment from the international community. It is thus necessary to stress respect for international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Accountability is also another fundamental pillar of the multilateral system, the rule of law, and sustainable peace. For this reason, without any pretext or precondition, those responsible for crimes committed in Ukraine must be brought to justice. In this regard, the work of the International Criminal Court is essential to investigate the reports of alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. We will follow with the greatest attention the progress of these investigations. Greatly concerning is the dimension of nuclear risk derived from confrontations around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Ensuring its integrity and proper operations is critical to avoid the worst of any possible catastrophe. We support the recommendations made by the IAEA after its technical inspection. These recommendations must be followed immediately. We support the calls to create a security perimeter around the plant. Lastly, we acknowledge the value of the signing of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. FAO indices have shown that grain prices in the last 2 months have begun to drop. It is a demonstration of the value of diplomacy. Even in the midst of war, dialogue and agreements are possible. It is also essential to guarantee the access of fertilizers to global markets, and we are encouraged to see that specific steps already have been taken in this direction. We acknowledge the leadership of the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the President of Turkey, in managing the aforementioned agreements. Madam President, since the beginning of the conflict, my country's position has been based on our constitutional principles of foreign policy, which are in accordance with the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly non-intervention, pacific settlements of disputes, and the prohibition of the threat or use of force. There is no space for ambiguity. Peaceful coexistence of states depends precisely on respect for all of these. There cannot be any exception. Over these months, we have been clear in reiterating the importance of Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations with regard to prohibiting the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state. Through our own experience, Mexico knows and well understands the importance of having the basic guarantee of being able to live without the threat of being invaded by another state. Any action violating this principle is illegal and illegitimate. The purpose of this organization and the mandate of this council is preventing the suffering of humanity from the scourge of war. But this can only be achieved through dialogue, diplomacy, and the building of effective political channels, and security of individuals and territorial integrity of countries. Indifference is unacceptable, and also unacceptable is simply deploring that until now, in this particular case, the Security Council has not been able to fulfill its responsibilities. The reasons why this council is dysfunctional are well known. Correcting them depends on us. The time is ripe to seriously raise the structural reforms which are required for this purpose. Madam President, based on its vocation for peace, Mexico believes that the international community must now channel its best efforts to attain peace. In this regard, allow me to share the proposal of the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, to bolster the mediation efforts of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres by creating a caucus for dialogue and peace in Ukraine, with the participations of other heads of state and government, including His Excellency Narendra Modi and His Holiness Pope Francis. The objective would be very clear: generating new mechanisms for dialogue and creating additional spaces for mediation, which foster trust, reduce tension, and open the path towards lasting peace. Mexico's delegation will continue with the necessary consultations with the sole purpose of contributing as an impartial, good faith actor to generating broad support for the mediation efforts of the Secretary General and the aforementioned caucus. And we hope that it will be created with the support of member states of the United Nations. As the Secretary General just said, the time has come to act, to commit to peace. Resigning ourselves to war is simply to stand on the edge of the abyss. Thank you very much. I thank His Excellency Mr. Evrard Casabon, and I give the floor to Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America. Thank you very much, Madam, for having brought this council together at this very grave moment of the crisis of the war of Russia on Ukraine.
Determination and the moral clarity that you've brought to ending this brutal war and defending the UN's core principles, and also for your personal engagement in securing the vital Black Sea route for grain to flow once again from Ukraine. Mr. Khan, we're grateful for the efforts of the Office of the Prosecutor to investigate objectively and professionally the atrocities being committed in Ukraine by Russian forces, and for its support for and coordination with Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors. We hear a lot about the divisions among countries at the United Nations. But recently, what is striking is the remarkable unity among member states when it comes to Russia's war on Ukraine. Leaders from countries developing and developed, big and small, North and South, have spoken in the General Assembly about the consequences of this war and the need to end it. And they've called on all of us to reaffirm our commitment to the UN Charter and its core principles, including sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights. Even a number of nations that maintain close ties with Moscow have said publicly that they have serious questions and concerns about President Putin's ongoing invasion. Rather than change course, however, President Putin has doubled down, choosing not to end the war, but to expand it, not to pull troops back, but to call 300,000 additional troops up, not to ease tensions, but to escalate them through the threat of nuclear weapons, not to work toward a diplomatic solution, but to render such a solution impossible by seeking to annex more Ukrainian territory through sham referenda. That President Putin picked this week, as most of the world gathers at the United Nations, to add fuel to the fire that he started, shows his utter contempt for the UN Charter, for the General Assembly, and for this Council. The very international order that we have gathered here to uphold is being shredded before our eyes. We cannot, we will not allow President Putin to get away with it. Defending Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is about much more than standing up for one nation's right to choose its own path, fundamental as that right is. It's also about protecting an international order where no nation can redraw the borders of another by force. If we fail to defend this principle when the Kremlin is so flagrantly violating it, we send a message to aggressors everywhere that they can ignore it too. We put every country at risk. We open the door to a less secure, a less peaceful world. We see what that world looks like in the parts of Ukraine controlled by Russian forces. Wherever the Russian tide recedes, we discover the horror that's left in its wake. I had a window into that horror myself when I traveled to Irpin just a few weeks ago to meet with the Ukrainian investigators who were compiling evidence of war crimes committed there. I saw up close the gaping holes left in residential buildings by Russian shelling, indiscriminate at best, intentional at worst. As we assemble here, Ukrainian and international investigators continue to exhume bodies outside of Izium, a city Russian forces controlled for 6 months before they were driven out by Ukrainian counteroffensive. One site contains some 440 unmarked graves. A number of the bodies unearthed there so far reportedly show signs of torture, including one victim with broken arms and a rope around his neck. Survivors' accounts are also emerging, including a man who described being tortured by Russian forces for a dozen days, during which his interrogators repeatedly electrocuted him and, in his words, and I quote, beat me to the point where I didn't feel anything, end quote. These are not the acts of rogue units. They fit a clear pattern across the territory controlled by Russian forces. This is one of the many reasons that we support a range of national and international efforts to collect and examine the mounting evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. We must hold the perpetrators accountable for these crimes. It's also one of the reasons why more than 40 nations have come together to help the Ukrainian people defend themselves, a right that is enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. The more setbacks Russian forces endure on the battlefield, the greater the pain they are inflicting on Ukrainian civilians. Russian attacks on dams, on bridges, on power stations, on hospitals, on other civilian infrastructure are increasing, constituting a brazen violation of international humanitarian law. This week, President Putin said that Russia would not hesitate to use, and I quote, all weapon systems available, end quote, in response to a threat to its territorial integrity. A threat that is all the more menacing given Russia's intention to annex large swaths of Ukraine in the days ahead. When that's complete, we can expect President Putin will claim any Ukrainian effort to liberate this land as an attack on so-called Russian territory. This from a country that in January of this year, in this place, joined other permanent members of the Security Council in signing a statement affirming that, and I quote, nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. Yet another example of how Russia violates the commitments it's made before this body, and yet another reason why nobody should take Russia at its word today. Every council member should send a clear message that these reckless nuclear threats must stop immediately. Russia's effort to annex more Ukrainian territory is another dangerous escalation, as well as a repudiation of diplomacy. It is even more alarming when coupled with the filtration operation that Russian forces have been carrying out across parts of Ukraine that they control. Now, this is a diabolical strategy, violently uprooting thousands of Ukrainians, bus in Russians to replace them, call a vote, manipulate the results to show near unanimous support for joining the Russian Federation. This is right out of the Crimea playbook. As with Crimea, it's imperative that every member of this council, and for that matter, every member of the United Nations, reject these sham referenda and unequivocally declare that all Ukrainian territory is and will remain part of Ukraine. And no Russian claim to annex territory can take away Ukraine's right to defend its own land. Putin's invasion is also distracting this council. In fact, the entire UN system from working on the serious issues that we all want to focus on, like preventing a climate catastrophe, aiding tens of millions of people on the brink of famine, fulfilling the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, shoring up our interconnected health security. All issues that make a tangible difference in the lives of the citizens that we are here to represent and that they are looking to us to deliver on. The overwhelming majority of UN member states are committed to working together on these issues, and our actions show that. Yet, while more than 100 countries have signed on to a roadmap to provide food aid to those who need it, and partners across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe are working together to increase the resilience of global food systems, Russia for months blocked the export of Ukrainian grain to the world until the United Nations and Turkey secured a deal to let the grain go. And Russia continues to bomb and seize Ukrainian farms and silos, line its wheat fields with landmines, raising the cost of food for people everywhere. And while governments around the world are teaming up with international organizations, with the private sector, with philanthropies, to end this pandemic and make sure that we're better prepared for the next one, Russia is spreading misinformation and disinformation about WHO-approved vaccines, fueling vaccine hesitancy that puts people in all our countries at greater risk. Here is the reality. None of us chose this war. Not the Ukrainians, who knew the crushing toll it would take. Not the United States, which warned that it was coming and worked to prevent it. Not the vast majority of countries at the United Nations. And neither did our people, or the people of virtually every UN member state, who are feeling the war's consequences in greater food insecurity and higher energy prices. Nor did the Russian mothers and fathers, whose children are being sent off to fight and die in this war, or the Russian citizens who continue to risk their freedom to protest against it, including those who came out into the streets of Moscow after President Putin announced his mobilization to chant, "Let our children live." Indeed, it must be asked, how has this aggression against Ukraine by President Putin improved the lives or prospects of a single Russian citizen? One man chose this war. One man can end it. Because if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. That's why we will continue to support Ukraine as it defends itself and strengthen its hand to achieve a diplomatic solution on just terms at a negotiating table. As President Zelensky has said repeatedly, diplomacy is the only way to end this war. But diplomacy cannot and must not be used as a cudgel to impose on Ukraine a settlement that cuts against the UN Charter or rewards Russia for violating it. President Putin is making his choice. Now, it's up to all of our countries to make ours. Tell President Putin to stop the horror that he started. Tell him to stop putting his interests above the interests of the rest of the world, including his own people. Tell him to stop debasing this council and everything it stands for. We, the people of the United Nations, determined. That is how the preamble of the UN Charter starts. Let's not forget that we, the peoples, still get to choose the fate of this institution and our world. The stakes are clear. The choice is ours. Let's make the right choice for the world that we want and that our people so desperately deserve. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Blinken, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Wang Yi, State Councillor and Minister of Foreign Affairs of China.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, I thank Foreign Minister Colonna for convening today's ministerial meeting, and I thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. China's position on Ukraine is consistent and clear. President Xi Jinping pointed out that the sovereignty, territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and the principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The reasonable security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts that could help resolve the crisis should be supported. China follows Ukraine's humanitarian situation very closely and has assisted Ukraine with 35 million yuan of humanitarian supplies. This year, we have provided other developing countries with 15,000 tons of emergency humanitarian food assistance and contributed positively to easing the global food crisis. In response to the current situation, China would like to make the following 4 proposals. First, we must stick to dialogue and negotiations. The top priority is for the parties to resume dialogue without precondition, commit to dialogue without presuming the outcome, include reasonable concerns into negotiations, and put feasible options on the table so that the talks can produce results and bring about peace. Second, we must work together for de-escalation. The parties concerned should exercise restraint and avoid escalating tensions. The international community should play a constructive role to help de-escalate and create conditions and space for political settlement. When it comes to the safety and security of nuclear facilities, there is no room for trial and error. Accidents and risks must be prevented. We support the IAEA in upholding a fair and objective position and playing a positive role. Third, we must earnestly ease the humanitarian situation. It is vital to observe the international humanitarian law, prevent any attacks against civilians, civilian facilities, and minimize civilian casualties. Investigations into violations of the international humanitarian law should be objective and fair, based on facts rather than an assumption of guilt and without being politicized. The international community needs to support the UN humanitarian agencies in upholding neutrality and equity and continue to provide assistance to those affected in Ukraine and its neighboring countries. Fourth, we must contain spillovers. Energy suppliers and consumers should work together to keep the global energy market stable. We support the Secretary General in helping facilitate the exports of Russian and Ukrainian grains. China, on its part, has put forth the International Food Security Cooperation Initiative, and we welcome positive response from all countries. No country should resort to arbitrary unilateral sanctions, still less let developing countries pay the price. Madam President, the Security Council, as the core of the collective security mechanism, should uphold the basic principles of objectivity and impartiality on the issue of Ukraine, keep to the right direction of ceasefire and peace talks, and prioritize mediation tools in the pursuit of settlement. We need to pour positive energy for peace and reconciliation and take constructive and responsible actions towards political settlement. The Ukraine crisis is closely linked to the international situation. The more challenging the situation is, the more important it is to stay united and seek cooperation. We must work in coordination to uphold the UN-centered international system, abide by the basic norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, accommodate the legitimate concerns of all parties, abandon hegemonism and power politics, and prevent any form of hot war or the so-called new Cold War. Let us commit to common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, seek common ground despite differences, accommodate and understand each other, and work tirelessly for restoring security in Europe and peace in the world. Thank you.
Je remercie son
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Wang, for his statement, and I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Olta Jaishankar, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania.
Madam President, I join other colleagues to thank France for convening today's briefing and Minister Colonna for chairing it. This issue has been without interruption on the agenda of the Council, but this meeting could not be timelier given the latest escalatory declarations by Kremlin. I also welcome the decision of the French presidency of the Council to continue keeping the focus on accountability, an issue of the utmost importance that we initiated together back in April with the ARIA formula meeting that Albania and France organized jointly. I also thank ICC Prosecutor General Khan for his information and his tireless efforts to establish accountability in Ukraine. Madam President, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, has waged an illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. In our judgment and in the eyes of the entire world, as clearly expressed more than once here in the United Nations, Russia's actions are a blatant violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Let's not forget that the highest international justice body, the International Court of Justice, has ordered Russia to suspend its military operation in Ukraine. International law is the same and mandatory for all. Russia has unfortunately chosen to openly and continuously ignore it. The very principle and belief upon which the UN was founded was that the only way to prevent war was through universal norms and laws accepted by all in the new post-World War II order. In the decades since, despite the challenges and difficulties, we have all managed to strengthen and expand the reach of international law and multilateral cooperation, and we have agreed that no one can stand above the law. We had hoped that the world would never again go back to the distant past, but the war in Ukraine and Russia's flagrant attempt to conquer and annex parts of Ukraine's territory are actions reminiscent of the dark days of fascism and Stalinism. And there is much more in what is happening in Ukraine today that is reminiscent of those dark days. Reports and fact-finding missions from the ground, footage the whole world has seen reveal a basic truth about Russia's actions, an appalling criminal brutality against the civilian population. Innocent men, women, and children in Ukraine, as well as tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, have paid with their lives for Vladimir Putin's war of choice. Millions around the world are going hungry because of Vladimir Putin's war of choice. We condemn Russia's new path of confrontation by announcing a partial mobilization in Russia, by supporting the organization of illegal referenda in 4 Ukrainian territories currently occupied, and by threatening again with the use of weapons of mass destruction. These sham referenda are another blatant violation of the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and a serious violation of the UN Charter. We reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and reiterate our call for Russia to completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This is why we must galvanize our forces and continue to help Ukraine defend itself. But that is why, too, we must work to guarantee full accountability for what Russia is doing in Ukraine. It is to provide justice, but this is also to prevent future atrocities. We all tried to prevent this conflict. We could not, but we must not fail to hold Russia accountable. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence Madame.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Jaishankar, for her statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, Secretary General Guterres. 1 week ago, I stood on the deck of a cargo ship in the port of Odessa. watching 46,000 tons of grain being loaded, bound for Bangladesh. That same day, the total amount of grain exported from Ukrainian ports through the Black Sea Grain Initiative had reached 3 million tons. Ukrainian and UN staff in Odessa spoke to me of their plans to reach 4 million tons of grain per month. Secretary General, as you have said so eloquently, those ships carry not just grain, but the rare commodity of hope. And they represent something else too, the power of multilateralism. In the midst of conflict, the UN and the government of Turkey negotiated a deal to get desperately needed grain out of Ukraine and onto world markets. This happened through dialogue, through using the systems and structures, the norms and institutions that we have painstakingly built over decades to resolve differences, to find solutions, and to deliver for our citizens. These are the principles and institutions that we, all of us around this table, have a solemn commitment to uphold. Madam President, let me recall another moment of hope. In January of this year, the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapons states, including Russia, declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and can never be fought. Those 5 leaders, including President Putin, committed to avoid military confrontations, strengthen stability and predictability, increase mutual understanding and confidence, and pursue constructive dialogue with mutual respect. Just 6 weeks later, Russia launched an unwarranted and illegal further invasion of Ukraine, of another sovereign UN member state, of a neighbor. And now, this week, President Putin again issues threats to use nuclear weapons. Let us be absolutely clear. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the antithesis of the principles of the UN Charter. It is a grave violation of international law. It's an attempt to change internationally recognized borders by use of force. And no sham referendums can change that basic fact. It cannot be allowed to stand. If we fail to hold Russia accountable, we send a signal to large, powerful countries that they can prey on their neighbors with impunity, which is something that every nation on earth should take note of. This is why Ireland yesterday filed a declaration of intervention at the International Court of Justice in Ukraine's case against Russia. It is why we are intervening in Ukraine's case against Russia at the European Court of Human Rights. It is why we have supported action at the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the UN General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council to hold Russia accountable for what it's doing. It's why, with 42 other state parties of the International Criminal Court, we referred the situation in Ukraine to the ICC prosecutor, who's with us here today. It is why we support Ukraine's efforts to establish a compensation and reparations mechanism. And it's why we will work with Ukraine and other partners to examine how we can hold Russia accountable for the crime of aggression. But it is also why this Council collectively must consider how it acts to protect the principles and purpose of the UN Charter itself. No one country, no matter how big or powerful, should have the ability to veto the application of international law for its own aims. Madam President, I said at this Council in April that without accountability, there is no hope for a sustainable peace. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere. And I repeat that today. I also recall here in April the shocking evidence I saw in Bucha of Russian forces' disregard for international humanitarian law. That was no fabrication. The bodies that I saw tell a story. 5 months later, more mass graves are being discovered in Izium and in other areas that were until recently under Russian occupation. Attacks by Russian forces on civilians and civilian infrastructure have intensified further since then. The devastating impact of explosive weapons in populated areas is ever more evident, with tens of thousands of homes, hospitals, and schools destroyed. This is why Ireland is seeking the wide endorsement by states of the political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas at a high-level adoption conference in Dublin in November. Madam President, millions of civilians in Ukraine and beyond are being potentially put at risk by Russia's occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I want to repeat the demand of last week's IAEA Board of Governors. Russia must immediately cease all actions against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Ukrainian authorities must regain full control. The last thing the world needs now is a nuclear accident. Madam President, this conflict can and will end. Our collective responsibility to the UN Charter, to the Pacific settlement of disputes, to the maintenance of international peace and security demands that it ends sooner rather than later. The path to peace is clear. The country that made a deliberate decision to start this conflict must now make the decision to bring it to an end. Russia must withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of a fellow UN member state. It must be held accountable for its actions through the international bodies and structures that we together have created for this purpose. It is not solely about Ukraine and its future. This is about the entirety of the UN membership, all of us and all of our countries. If we do not reject Russia's actions in the clearest and most stark terms, we allow the world to be governed by force and not through dialogue and the application of international law. Madam President, this Council must take the lead.
Son Excellence, Monsieur.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Coveney, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Dr. Subrahmanyan Jaishankar, Minister for External Affairs of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by congratulating the French presidency for its able stewardship of the Security Council this month. I also thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his briefing and take note of the remarks made by ICC Prosecutor Karim Khan. Allow me, Madam President, to preface my remarks by reminding the Council that India is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, nor a member of the International Criminal Court. Madam President, the trajectory of the Ukraine conflict is a matter of profound concern for the entire international community. The future outlook appears even more disturbing. The nuclear issue is a particular anxiety. In a globalized world, the impact of the conflict is being felt even in distant regions. We have all experienced its consequences in terms of surging costs and actual shortages of food grains, fertilizers, and fuel. On this score, too, there are good grounds to be worried about what awaits us. The global South, especially, is feeling the pain very acutely. We must, therefore, not initiate measures that further complicates the struggling global economy. And that is why India strongly reiterates the need for an immediate cessation of all hostilities and a return to dialogue and diplomacy. Clearly, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi has emphasized, this cannot be an era of war. On our part, we are also providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors under economic stress. Turning to the specific topic before the Council today, let me emphasize that even in conflict situations, there can be no justification for violation of human rights or of international law. Where any such acts occur, it is imperative that they are investigated in an objective and independent manner. This was the position we took with regard to the killings in Bucha, and this is the position we take even today. The Council will also recall that we had then supported calls for an independent investigation into the Bucha incident. The fight against impunity is critical to the larger pursuit of securing peace and justice. The Security Council must send an unambiguous and unequivocal message on this count. Politics should never, ever provide cover to evade accountability, nor indeed to facilitate impunity. Regrettably, we have seen this of late in this very chamber when it comes to sanctioning of some of the world's most dreaded terrorists. If egregious attacks committed in broad daylight are left unpunished, this Council must reflect on the signals we are sending on impunity. There must be consistency if we are to ensure credibility. Once again, let me emphasize, Madam President, that the need of the hour is to end this conflict in Ukraine and return to the negotiating table. This Council is the most powerful contemporary symbol of diplomacy. It must continue to live up to its purpose. The global order that we all subscribe to is based on international law, UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. These principles, too, must be upheld without exception. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency, Dr. Jaishankar, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Michael Moussa Adamo, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Gabon. Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank you, Madam President, for taking the initiative of this meeting on the situation in Ukraine, which is taking place in parallel to the high-level week of the General Assembly under the brand of bold solutions when the world is at a turning point. I thank the Secretary General for his update on the situation in Ukraine, as well as the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Mr. Karim Khan, for his briefing. Madam President, humanity loses its way every time it sinks into war and fails to protect civilians from atrocities and horror. The war in Ukraine challenges us on several fronts. It challenges us with the victims in thousands, the ruins of devastation and the distress of the injured. It challenges us on propaganda, disinformation, or rewriting reality. It challenges us with a nuclear threat and its potentially irreparable consequences. It challenges us with its shockwave on food security on the world scale. Faced with this avalanche of challenges, the peoples of the world turn to the Council for an answer to the multidimensional obstacles that rise on their path, the path of their aspirations to peace and international security. To the women, men, and children who fear a nuclear catastrophe and ask when war in Ukraine will stop, we owe an answer. Our reaction cannot be a confrontation of insults. We must rise to the responsibility entrusted to us in the Charter of the United Nations and the confidence which the peoples of the world have put in this organization. Gabon advocates a constructive dialogue to silence the guns. We are against war, against hate discourse, against outrageous rhetoric which feeds aggression and compromises prospects of peace. Madam President, my country notes with interest that the International Criminal Court has begun investigations into the crimes committed by all parties in the war in Ukraine in order to collect evidence and be able to establish both facts and the responsibilities for the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, both for the allegations of mass killings forced disappearances and displacement or deportations, justice must follow its course in full transparency, impartiality, and independence. All relevant international mechanisms must be used so that the authors of atrocities are made to answer for their crimes before international law. Gabon's message is clear. War is not a state of lawlessness. Parties to conflicts must respect international conventions protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure in wartime, particularly the Geneva Conventions. Madam President, standards applied to the war in Ukraine on all levels should be the same for any armed conflict. And the upsurge of compassion, assistance, and solidarity, which is all too deservedly reserved for the war in Ukraine, should be exactly the same for all victims of armed conflicts. Let us not forget, when the time comes, the fate of many Africans, including young students for whom the path to exile was all too often sown with shame and humiliation. Because of the color of their skin, many were refused the assistance they needed just as much as those sharing with them the same community of suffering, fear, and distress. While many hearts are torn by victims of the war in Ukraine, our hearts beat in time with theirs. And when discrimination is added to the horrors of war, humanity must rise together to strongly denounce it so the double standard is no longer the rule, and so the noise of tanks and firing are unbearable wherever they are heard. Madam President, it is urgent for the humanitarian crisis following the war in Ukraine to be dealt with and for its effects to be rapidly contained. Betting on time is taking the risk of seeing innocent people fall under fire, destroyed civilian infrastructure, more families torn apart, and thousands of war orphans. To conclude, we call on parties to negotiate in respect for humanitarian law, the practices, the principles of the UN Charter, and we support any initiatives reviving the hope for a solution. I thank you, sir, for your statement. I give the floor to Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President, Your Excellency, colleagues. As I understand it, today's meeting was motivated by the intention of several delegations to discuss the topic of impunity in Ukraine. I think this is very timely because this is precisely this term, impunity, reflects what has been going on in that country since 2014. The national radical forces, open Russophobes and neo-Nazis came to power then as a result of an armed coup with direct support of Western countries. And right after that, they took the path of lawlessness and totally ignoring main rights and freedoms, the right to life, right of expression, right of access to information, right of conscience, the right to use a native language. And to date, the crimes on the Maidan in February 2014 remain unpunished. Those who perpetrated the horrific tragedy in Odessa on the 2nd of May of 2014 have not been found or punished. At the time, at the House of Labor Unions, dozens were burned alive and died. In the same categories of political murders of Olesa Buzyn, Pavle Shermit, and other public figures and journalists. In spite of that, there's an attempt today to impose on us a completely different narrative about Russian aggression as the origin of all the tragedy. This ignores the fact that for over 8 years, the Ukrainian army and fighters from the nationalist formations killed and continue to kill inhabitants of Donbas with impunity simply because they refused to recognize the result of the coup d'etat in Kiev. They decided to uphold their rights, which were guaranteed by the Ukrainian constitution, including the right to freely use Russian, their mother tongue. Just recall how in 2015, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Yatsenyuk, declared that in Donbas, non-humans live in Donbas, inhumans. And the current president, Mr. Zelensky, did not go very far from that, who in an interview last September, when he was asked what he thought about the people who live in Donbas, he said, well, you know, there are people, and sometimes there are species. They're beings. This seems to be a very common reference of the Ukrainian authorities. They declared all those who don't agree there as terrorists, and for 8 years, the Kiev regime has been conducting a military operation against the peaceful civilians. And by the way, in Ukraine for many years now, total mobilization of all adult population, including women, is being conducted in order to recruit them into the ranks of nationalist battalions and the armed forces. Now, by cynically declaring its commitment to the Minsk agreements, the Kiev's authorities overtly sabotaged their implementation. There was financial transport blockade of Donbass. People were denied their pensions, their subsidies, their access to education. They were denied their basic civil rights, including those that were guaranteed by the international pacts of 1966. So at then Mr. Zelensky, having been tired of pretending, stated that it was impossible to implement the Minsk agreement. In fact, Mr. Poroshenko, just a couple months ago, proudly stated that the Minsk agreements, which he signed, neither him nor no one else in the Ukraine had any intention of implementing these, that these agreements were simply needed to win time in order to obtain weapons from the West for the war against Russia. And the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Mr. Danilov, said something very similar. Of course, the Kiev regime owes its impunity to its Western sponsors, first of all, Germany and France, but also the United States. Instead of pushing the Kiev authorities to implement the Minsk agreement, Berlin and Paris and Washington cynically ignored the growing threats of Kiev to resolve the problem of Donbass by force, the so-called Plan B. Over the past few years, the Kiev regime has conducted a frontal assault on the Russian language. It brazenly trampled on the rights of Russian and Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. Scandalous language laws were enacted on education in 2016, on ensuring the role of Ukrainian language as a state language in 2019, on the comprehensive general secondary education in 2020, on native peoples of Ukraine in 2021. All these laws are aimed at ousting the Russian language. In essence, it's complete ban. At the same time, laws were adopted that promoted the theory and practice of Nazism. The timid recommendations of the Venetian Commission of the Council of Europe and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the OSCE High Commissioner on minorities, on amending the language legislation were simply ignored by Kiev. And these multilateral structures at the same time didn't find the courage, or they were not allowed, to convince the Kiev authorities to fulfill their obligations they undertook in the area of human rights. The Ministry of Education of Ukraine has excluded Russian literature from the school curriculum. Books are being destroyed, just as in Nazi Germany. And ethnic Russians are being subject to intolerance. And today, the officials from Ukraine have no longer even tried to hide their anti-Russian feelings, calling on the killing of Russians. Just a few examples. Mr. Vrublevsky, the Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, who's now in Kiev, just a month ago declared in an interview, and I quote, "We're trying to kill the Russians, as many Russians as possible. The more we kill today, the fewer our children will need to kill." End of quote. Did anyone notice this quote? Just earlier this April, the mayor of Dnipro, Filatov, said something similar. The time of cold-blooded fury has come. Now we have a full moral right to calmly and with a clear mind to kill these non-humans around the world for as long as possible and as many as possible. End of quote. On the 13th of September of this year, just recently, Mr. Danilov stated, and I quote, "In towns where the Ukrainian armed forces enter, people will undergo Ukrainization without taking into account their views. This will apply not only to Russians, but representatives of other nationalities. And if you want to study any other language, such as Romanian, Polish, Ivrit, please go ahead, but not to be financed by our state. You can do it at your own expense. You can improve your educational level at your own expense. End of quote. Is there any need to say that all these Russophobic statements have remained unpunished? And we're not even talking about Russophobia here. This individual spoke about representatives of other ethnic groups that live in Ukraine. And of course, the ultimate was the interview with Mr. Zelensky on the 5th of August, who suggested to everyone who feels that they're Russian for the good of their children and grandchildren to get the hell out and to go to Russia. And I think the decisions that have been adopted by a whole range of regions of Ukraine about conducting referendums are the result of his advice. And under the guise of combating Russian aggression and separatism, Ukraine is strengthening its persecution of dissidents. In March, a ban on the activity of 11 political parties under the pretext of their links to Russia. Opposition Russian language television channels have been closed for any attempt to provide an alternative view to the official view. Journalists are persecuted. Madame Berezhnaya, a well-known public official who has often spoken at the UN and the OBSE, is in the prison of the security services. We have no doubt that Ukraine has become a completely totalitarian Nazi-like state where the norms of international humanitarian law are trampled on. There's no surprise that the armed forces and the national battalions are using the tactic of terrorists, using peaceful civilians as human shield. And here, what's particularly cynical is the position of states that are pumping Ukraine full of weapons and training their soldiers. The goal is obvious. They're clearly stating it, to drag out the fighting as long as possible in spite of the victims and destruction in order to wear down and weaken Russia. That policy means the direct involvement of the West in the conflict and makes them a party to the conflict. Intentional fomenting of this conflict by the collective West remains unpunished. Of course, you won't punish yourselves, sir. We have no illusions that today the armed forces of Russia are being and the militias of Lugansk and Donetsk are being opposed not only by the neo-Nazi formations of the Kiev regime, but the military machine of the collective West. And in real time, the regime of real time, using modern systems of weapons, ships, satellites, drones, NATO is providing intelligence to the Ukrainian armed forces and stating that, convincing them that Russia should be defeated on the field of battle. The official representatives of the European Union have stated this, and Russia should be punished by having any sovereignty stripped from it. This isn't even latent racism, but overt racism. Against the backdrop of mass shelling of towns and cities of Donbass, Mr. Zelensky is overjoyed at the effectiveness of Western weapons. Here's a quote: "At last we feel how powerfully Western artillery has begun to operate. The weapons that we've received from our Western partners, its accuracy is exactly what we need," he cynically stated. At the same time, there were no military or strategic targets located in the towns that were shelled. Only peaceful citizens of Donbass are suffering. Since the end of July, the armed forces are lobbing mortar rounds to the center of Donetsk and its environs that are banned. They're lobbing banned anti-personnel rounds called lobe or blade. This violates a convention in 1997 on the ban on anti-personnel mines ratified by Ukraine, as well as the second protocol of the Geneva Convention on Conventional Weapons. Such outrages remain unpunished because the United States and their allies, with the connivance of international human rights institutes, have been covering up the crimes of the Kiev regime based on the policy of Zelensky, might be a bastard, but he's our bastard. The inconvenient truth that darkens the image of Ukraine as the victim of Russian aggression is carefully hushed up and sometimes deleted. Even Western human rights organization Amnesty International, which is it's difficult to accuse of sympathies to Russia, has been severely criticized and called an agent of the Kremlin, simply because in its report it's confirmed facts about the fact that Kiev places heavy weapons at civilian facilities. Also, the criminal shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant remain unpunished, even though from the 1st of September, representatives of the IAEA have been present there, and it's not very difficult to establish who's guilty for the shelling. And I just want to recall that the visit of the IAEA mission to this power plant was artificially delayed, even though already on the 3rd of June, all details were agreed, and the mission could have gone to the power plant already. And then it was a very unpleasant situation where the DESA, Department of Security of the UN, refused to give authorization to the specific itinerary, and then this was not a very honest actions. It simply delayed the visit to the Zaporozhye power plant by 2 months, even by 3 months, or practically 3 months. We're very also concerned about the fate of Russian soldiers who were taken prisoners. There are very many examples of torture, including violation of international humanitarian law. I'm sure that all those who are interested in what actually happened saw a video of the torture atrocities by Ukrainian neo-Nazis against Russian soldiers who were thrown to the ground with their hands tied and were shot in the head. Did anyone here comment on this the crime at all? We have many witnesses of these criminal activities by the Kiev regime that have been happening since 2014. Russian law enforcement bodies cooperating with their colleagues from Donetsk and Luhansk republics are investigating these thoroughly. Over 220 individuals have been found to be complicit, including the high command of the Ukrainian armed forces, commanders of units who shelled the civilian population. Also, there were cases against mercenaries from citizens of UK, Canada, United States, Netherlands, etc. I can assure you that all perpetrators, independently of their nationality, will be held accountable. I also want to draw your attention to the following. When Russian and Ukrainian negotiators at the end of March practically reached an agreement on the parameters of an agreement proposed by Kiev, just a couple of days later, the tragedy in Bucha occurred. The fact that it was staged leaves no doubt in anyone's mind. And I want to draw your attention, colleagues, that Western colleagues, right after that staged event, immediately cried outrage and introduced a new package of sanctions, spuriously accusing us of killing innocent civilians. Since then, when that propaganda operation was conducted, no one has mentioned Bucha other than us. And once again, in the presence of the Secretary General and ministers, I would address you and say, please demand the Ukrainian authorities to take a simple step to publish information about those individuals whose bodies were shown in Bucha. I've been asking this for the past month. Secretary General, please use your authority for this. It would be very useful to get to the bottom of this episode. And of course, we also noticed the increased activity of international justice with regard to Ukraine. There's supposedly efforts to investigate crimes committed in Ukraine that are ascribed to Russian authorities. All this is simply a very a propaganda operation. I just want to recall that neither the coup d'état in 2014 or the tragedy in Odessa or the shelling of Donetsk or any other crimes have uh, led to any reaction from the International Criminal Court. And by the way, this International Criminal Court, we there were some 3,000 references sent to the International Criminal Court against crimes committed against the inhabitants of ICC. There has been no reaction. And it seems that the ICC has now received instructions to step up its activity. We have no confidence in the work of this body. For the past 8 months, we were waiting for steps to be taken against impunity in Ukraine, and we don't expect anything more from this institution or a whole range of other international institutions. Everything I've said today simply confirms that the decision to conduct the special military operation was inevitable. We have said this more than once. We've provided a huge number of facts which show how Ukraine prepared to play the role of anti-Russia as a staging ground to create threats against Russian security. And I can assure you that we will never accept this. Thank you very much.
Je remercie son
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lavrov, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. James Cleverly, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Khan, thank you. 77 years ago, UN members agreed solemn principles in the UN Charter, vital for international peace and security. They undertook to refrain from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. Yet 7 months ago, President Putin invaded Ukraine illegally and without justification. He ignored the resounding pleas for peace that I heard in this council on the 17th of February. Since then, Ukrainians' spirit of defense and defiance in the protection of their country continues to inspire free peoples and nations. Every day, the devastating consequences of Russia's invasion become more clear. UN agencies have confirmed more than 14,000 civilian casualties so far, and the actual total is likely to be much higher. More than 17 million Ukrainians in humanitarian need, 7 million displaced within Ukraine, and more than 7 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe. We see the mounting evidence of Russian atrocities against civilians, including indiscriminate shelling and targeted attacks on over 200 medical facilities and 40 educational institutions, and horrific acts of sexual violence. We see from the reports of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that in parts of Ukraine currently under Russian control, civilians are subject to torture, arbitrary detention, and forced deportation to Russia. And we have seen more grisly discoveries in Izium. And it's not just Ukrainians who are the victims. President Putin's war has spread hardship and food insecurity across the globe, plunging millions of the world's most vulnerable into hunger and famine. And once again, as we've seen here today, Russia has sought to deny responsibility. It has tried to lay the blame on those who have rightly imposed sanctions on President Putin's regime, in response to his illegal actions. Let us be clear, we are not sanctioning food. It is Russia's actions that are preventing food and fertilizer getting to developing countries. It is Russia's tactics and bombs that are to blame for destroying Ukraine's farms, infrastructure, and delaying its exports. I sat here in February, listening to the Russian representative assuring this council that Russia had no intention of invading its neighbor. We now know that was a lie. And today, I have listened to further installments of Russia's catalogues of distortions, dishonesty, and disinformation. He has left the chamber. I'm not surprised. I don't think Mr. Lavrov wants to hear the collective condemnation of this council. But we saw through him then, and we saw through him again today. We have information, which means that we know that Russia is about to hold sham referenda on sovereign Ukrainian territory with no basis in law, under the threat of violence, after mass displacements of people in areas that voted overwhelmingly for Ukrainian independence. We know what Vladimir Putin is doing. He is planning to fabricate the outcome of those referenda. He is planning to use that to annex sovereign Ukrainian territory. And he is planning to use it as a further pretext to escalate his aggression. That is what he plans to do. And we call on all countries to reject this charade and to refuse to recognize any results. We are used to seeing Russian lies and distortions. But let us listen to the testimony of Ukrainians who tell us the truth, who tell us the reality of President Putin's war. Dr. Olena Yuzvak, her husband, Ole, and their 22-year-old son, Dmitry, were abducted by Russian forces from their home in Hostomel near Bucha in March. Russian soldiers shot Ole twice in the legs before they were all blindfolded and bundled into an armored personnel carrier. And I want you to hear Olena's story in her own words, and I quote, "First, they took us to a bombed out house. The Russian soldiers kept saying they were going to kill us. My husband was left for hours lying on the floor in the pool of his blood. I don't know why. We'd done nothing wrong. Then they took my son away from us. I don't know where. I don't know if we'll ever see him again. I just want my boy back." End of quote. Olena's story and those of many others tell us the truth, the real truth. This is a war of annexation, a war of conquest, to which President Putin now wants to send even more of Russia's young men and women, making peace even less likely. Mr. Putin must understand the world is watching and we will not give up. Of members of the Security Council, we must unequivocally reject Russia's attempts to annex Ukrainian territory. We must make clear to President Putin that his attack on the Ukrainian people must stop, that there can be no impunity for those perpetrating atrocities, and that he must withdraw from Ukraine and restore regional and global stability. If he chose to, he could stop this war, a war which has done untold damage to the Ukrainian and the Russian peoples. His war is an assault on Ukraine, an assault on the UN Charter, and an assault on the international norms that protect us all. So, we stand with our Ukrainian friends for as long as it takes, because Ukraine's fight for freedom is the world's fight for freedom. It is our fight for freedom. And if Ukraine's sovereignty and territory are not respected, then no country is truly secure. These are the reasons why Ukraine can and must win. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cleverly, for his statement. I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Shirley Okorobochiwe, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana.
President, Excellencies, let me thank France for organizing this high-level meeting. I would also like to thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for setting the tone for this meeting with his very clear statement. We welcome also the briefing from Mr. Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC. The world has been united since this council's referral over Darfur in Resolution 1593, 2005, nearly 2 decades ago, that impunity anywhere poses serious threats to international peace and security, the international legal order, and our multilateral system. We have systematically reinforced our institutions and defined conduct and sanctions to expose, prevent, or punish those acts or behavior that defy the norms we are committed to live by. No state, however powerful, should get a pass. To do so unravels a central tenet of our global civilization. It puts at stake the lives and liberties of those less powerful, wherever they live. That is why the members of this council must act in an urgent and unified manner to end the near paralysis of the council and the war in Ukraine. The toll of that war is intolerable, and the lack of unified resolve risks making our universal organization an enabling factor for impunity in Ukraine. The damage to the standing of the Charter may be incalculable. Ghana is especially concerned about the intensification of the war in Ukraine across several lines, with civilian populated areas and civilian infrastructure being the targets of bombardments. We regret that the basic laws which govern the conduct of modern warfare and protect ordinary people who are caught in the crossfires of war have not been respected. We are distressed by the diverse, horrifying, and painful humanitarian threats which have accompanied the war. Some 14 million people, mostly women and children, have been displaced from their homes and face heightened risk of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Human trafficking, filtration processes, and forced disappearances, torture, and other violations of the rights and freedoms of the people are widespread. We remain gravely concerned by the manifest threats of a nuclear episode, whether by accident or deliberate action, because of the constant military engagements around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The disregard for the requisites for nuclear safety and security, including for the delineation of a safe zone, are deplorable. And we support the efforts by the International Atomic Energy Agency to avert a nuclear catastrophe. With the rising death toll, civilian casualties, and growing reports of war crimes and other human rights violations, we must uphold our responsibility as a council and send a clear message that perpetrators of atrocities would be held to account. The suffering in Ukraine is abhorrent and should not be dismissed as the mere consequence of war. To do so, we would be endorsing the atrocities and sanctioning impunity. In this regard, we underscore the importance of ensuring accountability for all war crimes committed in Ukraine. Accountability is fundamental to preventing impunity. We must affirm our determination that the litany of atrocious acts that have taken place in Ukraine would be submitted to thorough, transparent, and independent investigations to establish the facts and for the attribution of international crimes to their perpetrators. Ghana remains supportive of international accountability measures, including the various investigative processes being undertaken by the ICC and the Human Rights Council. We believe that in seeking criminal accountability and justice for the victims of the war in Ukraine, the important questions about international remedy and reparation measures, especially for victims of conflict-related sexual abuses, must be addressed. We also express our support for the United Nations Early Recovery and Resilience programs already being undertaken. Madam President, we have expressed several times our principled position against the aggression on Ukraine, which we consider to be a disregard for the rules of international law and the principles of the Charter. Ukraine, as a sovereign state and a member of this organization, has every right, we believe, and indeed a responsibility to defend its territorial integrity and political independence. We recognize the tremendous courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people. Ghana does not and will not recognize any territory that is unilaterally and forcefully required or acquired as dismembered from a sovereign entity. We reiterate the call on the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally cease its operations, withdraw its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, and respect its neighbors' sovereignty and political independence. The need for a credible pathway for a genuine diplomatic process is urgent. The barrel of the gun does not provide such a pathway. It only leads to needless loss of lives and destruction on both sides. Indeed, the costs of the war have been high, not only for the parties, but also for the rest of the world. As the President of Ghana said yesterday in his statement at the General Assembly, I quote, "Every bullet, every bomb, every shell that hits a target in Ukraine hits our pockets and our economies in Africa," unquote. In this regard, let me place on record Ghana's appreciation for the good offices of the Secretary General and other international actors to leverage life-saving humanitarian interventions at critical times of the war. We already note some positive impacts from the Black Sea Grain Initiative and urge the continuous and unrestricted shipment of grains to countries facing food insecurity. We encourage all stakeholders to reach an early agreement for the export of Russian fertilizers and crop products, especially needed for agrarian-dependent economies. Madam President, let me conclude with an appeal. In a week when the eyes of the world are on us and millions around the world look to the United Nations for leadership and hope, we must send a strong message that impunity will not be tolerated, that we need to act through concerted diplomacy to end the war in Ukraine. I thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank Her Excellency, Madam Boche, for her statement, and I give the floor to Mr. Carlos Alberto Franco, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. Madam President, I want to thank France for having organized this session.
Ukraine affects us all, even in regions far from where hostilities are taking place. The Security Council is the appropriate forum to seek a solution that ensures lasting peace. This week marks 7 months since the start of the conflict. Tens of thousands of people, many of them innocent civilians, lost their lives. There are millions of refugees and internally displaced persons whose return to their homes remains uncertain and who, with the approach of FUINTA, are faced with the prospect of a worsening humanitarian crisis. Over these 7 months, this Council has received numerous reports of serious human rights violations in the conflict zone, including against vulnerable groups, women, and children. Brazil condemns the abuses and defends an impartial investigation of the facts so that those responsible are held accountable for their actions. We also reiterate our call for full respect for international humanitarian law by all parties. Madame la Présidente, we have an urgent task before us to engage the parties in dialogue in order to secure an immediate ceasefire and the opening of negotiations for a peace agreement. The continuation of the hostilities endangers the lives of innocent civilians and jeopardizes the food and energy security of millions of families in other regions, especially in developing countries. The risks of escalation arising for the current dynamics of the conflict are simply too great, and its consequences for the world order unpredictable. Only diplomacy brings the prospect of viable solutions to conflicts between states. It is not the time to accentuate divisions or isolate parties. The priority of this Council must be to create conditions for the parties to engage in negotiations for a peaceful solution to the conflict. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence, M. Franz.
I thank Mr. França for statement, and I give the floor to Her Excellency Madam Mareem Al-Hashimi, Minister of State for International Cooperation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, at the outset, I would like to thank you for organizing this important meeting. I would like to also thank His Excellency, the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, and His Excellency, Mr. Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, for their valuable briefings. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine clearly generated different reactions across the international community. For some, it warned of a paralyzed multilateral system. For others, concern over the rise of bygone existential threats. And finally, there are those for whom the war presaged a return of historical polarization with all its portents for the world. Those differences were further illustrated by a divergence in states' responses to this war, as this Council and organization have heard repeatedly. Yet, those disparities existed alongside a unified expression of fidelity to international law and a need to respect it, a recognition of its function to separate a civilized international order from its antithesis. International law, as the UN Charter articulates, regulates the conduct and practice of states according to the principles of sovereignty, independence, good neighborhood, and territorial integrity, reinforcing in the process the security and prosperity of states regardless of their size or might. Madam President, the UAE will not deviate from its unequivocal call and its unwavering appeal for all parties to this war to abide by international law, including international humanitarian law, to respect its limits and to implement its provisions. In this context, the reports of daily violations are a cause of grave concern, especially regarding the war's repercussions on civilians. We also emphasize here the situation of women and children, especially those forced into displacement, who are consistently reported to suffer from sexual violence and exploitation, including by organized crime and human trafficking networks. All of us are aware of the disproportionate severity and violence that war and conflict inflict upon women and girls. Therefore, we welcome all ongoing efforts, including by UN agencies, to respond to the humanitarian situation while taking into account the unique impacts of the war on women and girls. While the immediate imperative is a cessation of hostilities, peace remains our ultimate goal, and its sustainability requires comprehensive reconciliation predicated on accountability and justice for the war's victims. We also reiterate that the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in conflict resolution and peace building is crucial, not only to reflect their distinct experience of war, but also their centrality to building peace. Madam President, the UAE remains steadfast in its approach, urging dialogue, de escalation, and calm, and encouraging cooperation and consensus building to ensure stability in and among states. We are also reminded here of a long standing observation. Repeated deviations from the law without consequence normalize the practice and create a race to the bottom. In this Finally, Madam President, I restate the UAE's call to both parties and all relevant stakeholders to pursue a peaceful end to this war through constructive and inclusive dialogue, which necessitates open lines of communication and a viable off ramp to preserve the prospects of a diplomatic solution. It is evident that the world before us, in all its diversity, is concerned with the consequences of this war on the international system, on food and energy security, and on the risks of an escalation confrontation. Therefore, we must carry out the duties entrusted to us and cooperate to overcome the world's most pressing challenges rather than seeing war and conflict set us back further. This approach and our promotion of it is the conclusion drawn from our experience in the Middle East, where people have been battered by a relentless insistence on zero sum hegemony and the pursuit of narrow self interest. This has left and will only leave destruction. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie Madame Hashimi.
I thank Madam Al-Hashimi for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. George Orina, Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kenya.
Madam President, Excellencies. Madam President, Kenya's delegation commends you and France for the able stewardship of the Security Council during the month of September. I thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Mr. Karim Khan for their updates on the situation in the Ukraine. The war in the Ukraine is a serious breach of the United Nations Charter. The obligation to respect the territorial integrity of all member states will be further undermined should any action be taken to change the legal character of the areas in eastern Ukraine. We are in a moment of grave danger to international peace and security. The escalation of the war the international community feared is underway. There are now clear threats being issued about the potential deployment of weapons of mass destruction in the conflict. On the battlefield, civilians are being subjected to serious harm in contravention of the fundamental international law and human rights obligations. It is a priority of the utmost urgency that national authorities subject their soldiers to severe disciplinary action for any abuses, especially on civilians and captured combatants. Military commanders should surrender those suspected for such atrocities to the relevant authorities for prosecution. All the parties, including those making allegations of human rights abuses, or all those against whom the allegations are made, should agree to prompt, independent, and impartial investigations. Even as we justly condemn and call for accountability of war-related violations, we know that the truest protection of civilians is to stop the war. In this regard, Kenya calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Active hostilities should be replaced by a mediated agreement that secures the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine while addressing the security concerns of all parties and regional stakeholders. Madam President, the situation in Ukraine is highlighting the need for serious reforms of the United Nations Security Council. His Excellency Dr. William Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya, in his speech yesterday at the General Assembly, called for the democratization of the Security Council if its damaged legitimacy is not to be totally destroyed. Our President made the clarion call that it was time that the Council more powerfully heeded the voice and place of Africa through reform of its membership. He welcomed President Joe Biden's announcement calling for the permanent and non-permanent membership of the Council to be expanded. If there is a major result the world needs from Ukraine, beyond peace and security for the people of Ukraine, it is for such an announcement to lead to real change. The farmers, villagers, pastoralists, fishfolk, traders, and workers of Africa need their livelihoods protected from the climate crisis. They need the many serious conflicts on the Security Council agenda solved and not relegated to the margins because of the Ukraine. Who will protect their interests in the Security Council by having the means from an amended UN Charter? Only permanent membership by the African states will do. In this regard, we call on the entire permanent membership to commit to fully embracing reforms. It is the only way the people of the world will consider this institution legitimate enough to earn their regard and cooperation. Madam President, I conclude by saluting the individuals, institutions, and governments, as well as the UN bodies and agencies that continue to help alleviate the suffering of those affected by the war in Ukraine. I reaffirm Kenya's respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized border. I thank you for your kind attention.
Je remercie Son Excellence, Monsieur Orina, pour...
I thank His Excellency Mr. Orina for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Secretary General Guterres, Prosecutor Hahn, I thank the French presidency for keeping the focus of the Security Council on the most pressing threat to international peace and security in this century, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Right as we speak, bodies of innocent victims are still being exhumed from at least 445 graves in the recently liberated city of Izium. Some are not entire bodies, but only parts of them, like a few pairs of children's legs in one of the graves. The grief of those who are close and beloved is yet another drop in the ocean of suffering that Russia has inflicted upon the people of Ukraine since 7 months and 8 years of its barbaric aggression. Many of you may have seen the image of a dead hand of a 36-year-old Ukrainian soldier. His name was Sergei Sova, with a yellow and blue bracelet still on it. I do wear one too. Just want to show it to you. Many of us do. And Russia should know one thing. it will never be able to kill all of us. And here is why. Because on February 24th, when Russia attacked Ukraine from all directions, within the first 24 hours, tens of thousands of Ukrainians returned from abroad to defend their country. And what happened within the first 24 hours after President Putin announced mobilization? The opposite. Thousands of Russians booked international flights to leave Russia. Many flights were sold out within hours. Yesterday, Putin announced mobilization. But what he really announced before the whole world was his defeat. You can draft 300, 500,000 people, but you will never win this war. Today, every Ukrainian is a weapon ready to defend Ukraine and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Russia will fail and will bear full responsibility for the crime of aggression and consequent war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Yesterday, President Zelensky made it clear in his address that Russian responsibility is a key element to international peace and security. Ukrainian law enforcement, together with partners at the International Criminal Court and countries who support both Ukraine and the ICC, work collectively to collect evidence of Russian crimes and hold perpetrators to account. We trust in the International Criminal Court. Justice will be served. We owe it not only to thousands of victims, but to future generations in Ukraine and beyond. There will be no peace without justice. I emphasize that none of the Russian crimes in Ukraine would have been possible without the crime of aggression against Ukraine committed by Russian leadership. It cannot go unpunished. And the only feasible way to put President Putin and his entourage on trial is to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. I reiterate my call on all states to back this undertaking for the sake of the very basic principles of humanity and the UN Charter. Excellencies, many of you may listen to me right now with one question in mind. Is there a chance for peace? Will Ukraine negotiate with Russia in order to end this war? I want to state crystal clear. No other nation in the world craves for peace more than Ukraine. President Zelensky was very outspoken about it yesterday. We have never wanted anything but peace and stable development. We have never wanted this war and never chose it. We simply want to live normal life. But it's not enough for Ukraine to want peace. Russia must prioritize diplomacy over war in order to give peace a chance. What we see instead is Russian leadership seeking a military solution only. Distinguished colleagues, this chamber has seen many heated debates since 1945, many crises. But the amount of lies coming from the Russian diplomats is quite extraordinary. Today, we are mostly focusing on crimes committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. But if anyone thinks they are the only one ready to kill, torture, rape, cut off genitals, they are wrong. Russian diplomats are directly complicit because their lies incite these crimes and cover them up. Apparently, the only thing in today's address by Russia in this torrent of lies worthy of reaction is the inappropriate slang used when mentioning a president of a foreign country, the president of Ukraine. I also noted today that Russian diplomats flee almost as aptly as Russian soldiers. Before February 24th, Russian diplomats here at the United Nations had repeatedly denied plans of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Russian president himself lied into the face of European leaders, saying he was not planning to attack. It was days before the invasion. Russia is shameless. They sit at the chair they occupied in 1991 on dubious legal grounds, armed with a veto right and the feeling of total impunity. Russians are confident that they can get away with anything and they are entitled to do anything they want. They think this seat allows them to violate borders in a 19th century style imperialist conquest. They think it allows them to shell nuclear power plants and seize them. They think it allows them to unleash missile terror on civilians and critical infrastructure. They think it allows them to threaten the world with the use of nuclear weapons. They must be held accountable for all of this. The issue of responsibility is central to the debate. We need to ensure that behavior like this is punishable. Otherwise, every force in the world, every evil force in the world, will be tempted to follow in Russia's footsteps. I don't need to remind anyone at this table how many forces on the planet would like to question the borders of their neighbors. If Russia can do this, why can't they? Today, we're talking not only about Ukraine and Russia. The global security crisis we all face is so much larger. All members of the Council must realize that on February 24th, Russia attacked not only Ukraine, it dealt a deadly blow to the very foundations of the United Nations Charter. No nation can feel safe until Russia is held to account for violating the common principles agreed by all after the Second World War. Russia does not care for them, but there are 192 other UN member states, nations of Asia, the Pacific, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Europe are all interested in upholding the UN Charter today. And Ukraine is fighting to defend principles of this charter, especially the principle of territorial integrity. Madam President, Russia's war of aggression has plunged the world into a multifaceted crisis. The consequences of this crime are felt far beyond Ukraine. Once Russian warships blocked Ukrainian seaports, it became clear that Ukrainian agricultural exports are vital to global food security. Russia has demonstrated that it is ready to put millions of people across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East at the risk of hunger simply to achieve its imperialistic goals. I take this opportunity to thank UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Turkey for facilitating the Black Sea Grain Initiative that allowed Ukraine to resume maritime grain exports this summer. Putin recently lied when he said that most of the grain has been sent to European countries. In fact, 2/3 of the grain we shipped went to consumers in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The resumption of Ukrainian exports has tamed food prices and allowed to ease the acute food insecurity, especially for those most vulnerable. Today, the Black Sea Grain Initiative is under threat. Russian officials are questioning the effectiveness of the corridor and might prepare to block the extension of the initiative once the agreed 120 days are over in November. We must not allow Russia to resume its hunger games with the world. I therefore urge all nations, especially those depending on Ukrainian food exports, to put maximum public and diplomatic pressure on Moscow, demanding to keep the Black Sea Grain Corridor functioning in November and beyond. We need to protect the vital grain initiative together. Ukraine remains a global food security guarantor. Despite our own dire situation, we decided to provide humanitarian aid to Ethiopia and Somalia, sending them an additional amount of our grains. Ukraine is interested in increasing maritime export volumes, both under the UN Food Programme and on market conditions. While hitting peaceful Ukrainian cities with missiles, Russia uses food and energy as weapons against the rest of the world. Putin sends tanks into Ukraine to kill Ukrainians, while stealing the well-being and stability from every European household with energy blackmail and playing hunger games with Asian, African, Middle Eastern families by threatening the functioning of the grain corridor. We are in the same boat, all of us, Europeans, Asians, Africans, Arab nations, Latin American states. We are in the same boat, and we must confront these threats together. There is no place for neutrality. I said back in February here at the United Nations that no nation will be able to sit out this crisis created by Russia. It still stands. The best reaction to this crisis: stand with Ukraine to protect the UN Charter. Russia likes to talk about the developed world and the developing world. They try to drive a wedge between ones and the others. We in Ukraine do not differentiate. All people deserve a normal life, safety, stability, and confidence. But we must stay united to stop Russia's blackmail and the war on humanity it launched. Dear colleagues, the most important pillar of international peace and security is the territorial integrity of states. No country is allowed to change internationally recognized borders by force. Russia has badly damaged this principle, and now the threat of war is hanging over everyone's head. To restore international peace and security, we need urgent and decisive action. Yesterday, President Zelensky proposed a peace formula which includes not only accountability, but a mechanism of security guarantees based on Article 51 of the UN Charter. Ukraine has developed the Kiev Security Compact, proposing a modern, multi-layered mechanism of guarantees to ensure Ukraine's security until the moment it becomes part of NATO. This document, though, is much broader than a tool of guarantee the security of Ukraine only. We see it as a universal mechanism that can be considered and applied to other countries and contexts in order to strengthen regional and global security architecture. Ukraine keeps working with partners to realize the vision of the Kiev Security Compact. This is our added value to international peace and security for all UN member states. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kuleba for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Jan Lipavsky, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Czechia.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies. Let me thank the French Presidency for the opportunity to participate in this important meeting. The Czech Republic now holds the rotating EU presidency. The EU is a core promoter of values and principles of the UN Charter. Czechia hosts the highest number of Ukrainian refugees per capita, over 400,000 in 10 million country. Russia's colonial, unprovoked and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine sent this massive wave of the most vulnerable population abroad. Russian aggression is perhaps the most dangerous challenge to global peace in recent decades. Today, it is about Ukraine. Tomorrow, it may be another country. In August 1968, it was Czechoslovakia, invaded by Moscow-led troops. A crackdown on the so-called Prague Spring, a violent interference in another country's peaceful life, turning my country into an occupied colony. We are hearing about the hastily organized sham referendums in part of Ukraine. Russia cannot trick the international community and steal again another state's territory. Russia's aggressive colonial policy and imperial desires must be rejected for good. Ukraine refused the slavery and bravely fights for a multilateral world where rules protect peace. We are horrified by the atrocities committed by Russian troops in Mariupol, Bucha, Irpin, Izium, and elsewhere, and extremely concerned by the reports on the so-called filtration camps run by Russia in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens have been deported to Russia, including children. There are testimonies of sexual and gender-based crimes used as a method of warfare. All must be investigated and perpetrators must be held accountable. We applaud the Secretary General for launching the UN fact-finding mission on events in Olenivka. More than 40 states, including Czechia, referred the situation in Ukraine to the ICC, which opened its investigation into the situation in Ukraine already in March. We strongly support the ICC, including by seconding a public prosecutor and by voluntary contributions. And we call for establishment of a special international tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression committed by Russia. Czech law enforcement agencies have launched criminal investigation of certain crimes based on the principle of universal jurisdiction. The Security Council members bear global responsibility for peace and respect to international law. Please act. We need peace in Ukraine. We need to restore respect for the UN Charter and international law. We need to ensure justice for victims and to stop impunity of the perpetrators. Thank you very much.
Je remercie son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lipavsky for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Madame la Ministre.
Madam President, dear colleagues, Bucha, Mariupol, Izium. When we talk about the horrors of the unfolding war in Ukraine, we are not talking about abstract reports. We are talking about children, we are talking about mothers, about brothers, about fathers, about grandparents, women and men whose pain is raw. Therefore, I urge Russia, this is a war you will not win. So end the war. Stop the suffering in Ukraine. Stop sending more of your own citizens into death. Stop your shame referendums, which are as unlawful as the war they are supposed to legitimize. Stop the grain war that is driving hunger across the globe, especially in the south. And stop paralyzing this very body, the United Nations Security Council. For many of you here and for some in the General Assembly, this war might have seemed like the regional war far away in February 24th. Because in many parts of the world, there's too much suffering itself, driven by conflict, driven by climate catastrophe, driven by the pandemic and by hunger. We did hear this. We in Germany, we could also feel you in this understanding. But I think we all feel together now here in the Security Council, but also in the General Assembly, that since the last 200 days, what is happening can leave nobody around the globe untouched. Now, for 200 days of Russia's brutal war in Ukraine, President Putin's most recent announcements make it clear beyond any doubt. Russia is not conducting a so-called special operation. Russia is leading a full-fledged war of aggression with war crimes, with torture, with rape, even of children. Russia's war is since 200 days is also increasing the hunger, the poverty, the insecurity in the world all around the globe. And I think this is a clear sign that the Russian foreign minister only came in for his own speech and then spoke for quite some while, but didn't even mention the hunger, the poverty, the results all around the world. And today in the streets of Moscow, there are no queues of volunteers wanting to join the war in Ukraine. What we see instead are courageous men, women, and even children taking to the streets because they do not want to be part of this war against Ukraine, and they want not to be part of the hunger war in the world. These men and women feel what we all feel, regardless of where we hail from north, south, east, or west. That all this war brings is pain, death, and destruction. Today, here in this chamber, we have to ask, therefore, ourselves, if we let a permanent member of this council launch such a war of aggression against this neighbor, what would this mean for the United Nations? For an institution whose charter states that, I quote, all members shall refrain from the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. If the charter means anything to us, we must not stand idle by, but live the spirit of our charter, not in spite of, but particularly because of one member misuses its special veto rights in the Security Council. Live up the spirit of this Charter of the United Nations as it has been lifted up by the UN and our Turkish partners who brokered the grain deal. As it is a World Food Programme, which is also supported by Germany, that is shipping the grain to Yemen and to the Horn of Africa. Live up the spirit of United Nations as the United Nations and the International Criminal Court that collect evidence to ensure that the perpetrators in this war are held accountable. Live the spirit of the United Nations as the IAEA that is working to prevent a catastrophe at the Zaporizhzhia power plant and whose efforts are supporting in talks with all sides. Live up the spirit of the United Nations in contrast to the Russian president, because we are the United Nations, from north to south, from east to west, no matter how small, no matter how big. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Baerbock for her statement. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Zbigniew Rau, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Monsieur le Ministre.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear ministers, the main reason behind today's meeting is Russia's decision to attack its neighbor, a fellow member state of the United Nations. Russia, despite being a permanent member of the Security Council, whose responsibility for international peace and security should be even greater, decided to breach the most fundamental principles of our world order. The invasion has shown a total disrespect and disregard for international humanitarian law and human rights law. The Russian forces have committed horrific atrocities, extrajudicial executions of civilians, enforced disappearances, torture, or sexual violence, including against children. Unable to crack Ukraine's military resistance, Russia turned to terror against civilians as a basic tactics of its war. Each day brings new evidence and testimonies of Russian crimes committed in the occupied territories. We are shocked by the discovery of chambers of torture and mass graves containing bodies showing signs of torture and brutality in newly liberated Izium. With new reports coming, Izium may become another symbol of Russia's barbaric methods. Against this dire background, Poland continues to advocate for full accountability for all the violations and compensation for the inflicted damage. We support the investigations by Ukrainian prosecutors, as investigations initiated by other states. We have been closely cooperating with the International Criminal Court Prosecutor's Office. We were among the broad group of the OEC participating states who twice invoked the OEC Moscow mechanism. We support the work of the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry. Also, we have opened a domestic criminal investigation into Russia's war of aggression. This is a crime penalized under Polish law. Finally, Poland has helped to establish a joint investigation team operating within the EU Agency for Criminal Justice Cooperation framework to collect and preserve evidence of the committed crimes. We should give due consideration to several initiatives put forward by Kiev, such as the Special Tribunal for Crimes of Aggression committed against Ukraine and the international mechanism to provide compensation for damage caused by Russia. Let me reaffirm Poland's solidarity with the people of Ukraine, who have shown remarkable courage, resolve, and resilience. They have stood up for their country and their independence with bravery and determination. Now, it is our turn to stand up for the principles that protect us all. We must hold Russia accountable for the invasion and all the crimes committed in the course of this aggression. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Rao, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Gabrielius Landsbergis, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Lithuania.
Monsieur le Ministre.
Madam President, I have the statement on behalf of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The major reason we meet today is that the permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, is openly threatening security and the rules-based global order, the very cause this council was created for. Just a year ago, Russia was sowing lies and distrust. Now it is sowing chaos and death. Day by day, Russia defies the principles of the United Nations and has already become a synonym of brutality, state-run terrorism, and genocide. At this very moment, the international community cannot and should not turn away. Yesterday, we all woke up to one more Putin's attempt to escalate aggression. By announcing mobilization, he now has waged the war against his own people, against the people who meant to be the future of the country, but are now turned into the weapons of colonial past. Sowing fear, blackmailing, manipulating are the very few weapons he has left with. Sowing scare is his only tactics. But we shall fear not. We shall meet Putin's desperate saber rattling with calm and resolve. Condemnation alone will not end these crimes. It is imperative that the international organizations use all of their resources to bring Russia's atrocities to the public light and on the charge sheets of international justice. It is our duty to bring Putin to justice. The special tribunal to address the crime of Russia's aggression against Ukraine must be established. Thus, if international organizations will stand up for justice half as strong as Ukraine stands for the universal values, peace will prevail and justice will prevail. Madam President, Russia's war against Ukraine has far-reaching consequences beyond Europe. Ukraine is one of the major exporters of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. Thus, we shall make it very clear the shortage of food is due to Russia's aggression against Ukraine and due to the blockade of the Ukrainian ports and not because of internationally imposed sanctions. And as if the charge sheet was not full enough, the Moscow regime has now pressed the button of nuclear threats, knowing that we all know that the consequences of the disaster in Zaporizhia may be potentially worse than Chernobyl or Fukushima. But we shall fear not. We shall use all the power of international community to demand from Russia the unconditional withdrawal of its military from Zaporizhia. Madam President, when we say Ukraine, we mean true courage and unbeatable resilience. Ukraine fights for every principle the UN stands for. Ukraine fights for every one of us. Therefore, Madam President, I call on this Council, do not fear to act, fear of your doubt and indifference. I call on every state, we still have a chance to preserve peace and security by taking right decisions to defend the rules-based international order. I call on the entire international community. Accountability matters, and justice cannot be escaped. This is the momentum when we have the chance to decide in what world we want to wake up tomorrow. And just before I go, I want to remind that it's not just only Russia that shall be held accountable. The regime of Belarus shall be on the charge sheet too. Slava Ukraini. I thank you.
Je remercie son...
I thank His Excellency Mr. Landsbergis for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Vladimir Makey, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus. Minister. Madam President, events on the territory of Ukraine is a huge tragedy. It's a tragedy for the country and for all those who have come face to face with pain and privation that come as a result of any fighting and wars. Belarus, due to its historic past, knows firsthand the cost of war for people who have experienced genocide and who a country that lost 1/3 of its population during the Great Patriotic War. Today, the conflict is unfolding at our borders, in our neighbors. We are convinced that only through diplomacy, with the help of negotiations and based on mutual understanding, is it possible to resolve any conflict, including this one. Now, the events in Ukraine did not come about suddenly. They are the result of a systematic ignoring of the risks of security in the region by Western countries and not taking into account the concerns of the countries involved. The premise to the situation took form over many years. Furthermore, the massive sanctions pressure by the West has led to indirect consequences that have had a devastating impact on our region. Sanctions have significantly reduced the margin of maneuver for Belarus. Belarus has often warned about the dangers of in our region and the threat to degrade the security structure that was formed over many years. Unfortunately, we were not heard. The tragic result of this arrogant position we're seeing today in Ukraine, we have always repeated, you cannot guarantee the security of one state by suppressing the security of another. No one took this seriously. Today, we're reaping the harvest of this. Belarus has done and continues to do everything possible to take steps aimed at ending the conflict and strengthening regional and international security. I'll just give a few examples. In 2014-2015, Belarus served as a platform for negotiations and reaching an agreement on Minsk I and Minsk II on resolving the conflict in the Ukraine. And no matter how anyone tries to deny this, the agreements at the time eased the level of military the fighting significantly. In between 2014 and 2019, we held some 120 meetings of the Trilateral Contact Group on resolving the situation in Ukraine. We took part in dialogue with all interested countries, including with our European partners, and proposed concrete steps to support peace and security. Perhaps people don't know this, but in 2014, when the Maidan took place, the then Prime Minister of Poland called President Lukashenko and asked what could be done to ease tensions in Europe. Mr. Lukashenko then sent me to Warsaw with concrete proposals that were heard with interest, and we were told that the president said that I will consult with President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel, and we will get in touch with you. Unfortunately, we heard nothing more about it. Obviously, there was not enough courage to work with Belarus, which at the time was under sanctions. This year, there were 3 rounds of peace negotiations in Belarus. And as a result of these negotiations, the outcome of these negotiations, all participants declared some positive progress in ending the conflict. Unfortunately, sometime later, that positive progress was stopped. From the very beginning, we suggested to our Ukrainian colleagues to establish direct contacts with the Russian side. However, our proposals were ignored. I don't know why, but even long before the special military operations began by Russia back in December of 2021, Ukrainian officials declared Belarus as a hostile country. Even though we were neighbors, we had good trade relations, and we never had any problems with Ukraine. Starting from March of 2022, Belarus introduced a visa-free regime for Ukrainians and all foreign citizens who are fleeing the fighting in Ukraine. They were provided the necessary assistance, including humanitarian assistance, as soon as they reached Belarus. Starting in February of this year, Belarus has taken in some 50,000 Ukrainian citizens. Overall, since 2014, our country has taken in more than 200,000 Ukrainian citizens. And you should note that they're not coming to Belarus by force, as some have tried to present. They're coming voluntarily. Furthermore, they come from through Poland, through the Baltics. Furthermore, in order to provide assistance to citizens who come to Belarus, the president of Belarus on the 14th of September signed a new version of the decree on the presence of citizens of Ukraine in Belarus. In accordance with that decree, Ukrainian citizens have all the rights provided to Belarusian citizens. Unfortunately, the conflict has seen no let-up. Military fighting has continued, as well as the uncontrolled Western efforts to pump Ukraine with weapons. The activity of Ukrainian ultranationalist formations is being promoted. NATO is concentrating its troops at the borders of neighboring countries. An aggressive anti-Belarusian campaign has been launched. Belarus is stated to be an abettor of the aggressor and a party to the conflict. We have stated very clearly Belarus has never been in favor of war. However, we're not traitors. We have obligations to our allies, and we respect international agreements. At the same time, Belarus absolutely clearly states that not a single Belarusian soldier or any equipment have been sent to Ukraine. Independent OSCE experts have confirmed that Belarus is not a party to the international military conflict based on the norms of international law. All accusations against Belarus that have been made here by the West are absolutely unfounded and spurious. Minsk is a direct neighbor and is interested in participating in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine about a strategic peace agreement that should create the necessary conditions for peace. Ladies and gentlemen, strengthening security, national, regional, and global security should be done not by increasing military capacity, but rather through universal, multilateral, and bilateral mechanisms to strengthen confidence. Only a fully fledged and mutually respectful dialogue aimed at overcoming differences can prevent confrontation in our region. One last thing. Today, everything sooner or later ends at the negotiating table. This is the truth, and the sooner these negotiations begin, the better. So it was surprising to hear the statements of certain people here that we should continue fighting. These statements are contrary to common sense. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. McKay, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Joseph Borrell Fontanelles, High Representative of the European Union for Security Policy and Foreign Affairs.
Monsieur le représentant.
High Representative.
Madame la Ministre, merci beaucoup.
Madam Minister, thank you very much to the French Presidency of the Security Council for organizing this very important session.
It's more than 6 months now into this illegal, senseless, and brutal war. As it has been said by many here today, this is a frontal attack on the United Nations Charter and the international rules-based order. It's a chemically pure attack on the United Nations Charter. Let's join our voice to the International Court of Justice that has ruled that Russia must halt its invasion immediately. By large majorities, the General Assembly has adopted resolutions calling on Russia to stop its aggression. Morally and politically, Russia has already lost the war. And increasingly, it is losing on the battlefield as well. Ukraine will prevail. The whole world has heard President Putin's latest announcements and his plan to go ahead with sham referenda as a prelude to illegal annexation, which will be never recognized. And also his mobilization of 300,000 reservists and his open nuclear threats. By all that, world security is in danger. Global leaders meeting at the United Nations in New York this week must send a clear and united signal that the use of weapons of mass destruction is unacceptable in any circumstances. I am encouraged by the many statements I heard here today about this issue. Regrettably, President Putin is continuing along the dangerous path of escalation. He's trying to intimidate Ukraine and all countries that support Ukraine. But this will fail. It has failed in the past and it will fail again, as all wars of invasion eventually do. But how many more men, women, and children need to die before the Russian president decides to silence his guns? This war is more than a war in Europe. At stake is the protection of weaker states from more powerful ones. Do we want the global rule of law, or do we want the law of the jungle? Do we believe in the spheres of influence, or on the free choice of sovereign states? This war is a tragedy in so many ways. In addition to the terrible casualties and the destruction caused in Ukraine, Russia is dragging the world into an economic recession and a global food crisis. As the European Union, we do what we can to counter this fallout. Our support for global food security amounts to more than 7.7 billion until 2024. We support the Black Sea Grain Initiative facilitated by the Secretary General and Turkey. Together with our European Union solidarity lanes, this has helped to lower global food crisis, but unhappily not to cancel it. 2/3 of the Ukraine grain exported this way goes to those countries that need it most, not to the Europeans. The core issue today is accountability. Russian armed forces have been terrorizing civilian populations and are committing countless unspeakable crimes: mass murder, destruction, rape, and forced migration. All victims of Russian aggression deserve justice and reparation. We have seen the recent images from the massacres in Izium follow the pattern we saw in Bucha and elsewhere. As Russian troops are expelled, we discover the true horrors of the occupation. As President Zelensky said in the General Assembly yesterday, where there have been crimes, there must be justice. Otherwise, peace will not be possible. We will do whatever it takes to ensure accountability. We rely on the International Criminal Court and on the Ukrainian authorities. We are supporting the ICC financially and technically and assisting the Office of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General by providing training, expertise, and equipment, including on collective evidence. Madam President, ensuring accountability is the responsibility of all of us. We owe this not only to the victims, but also to the next generation, to the future of Ukraine. Because fighting impunity today will contribute to a more secure and just future for all. Thank you.
Je remercie son...
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Borrell Fontellas, for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Well, you know, Sally, I was being here about 6 months ago, standing right here at another Security Council meeting where Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was the guest, and via video link from Kyiv back then. Without warning, he played some videos, very, very graphic videos of what had happened in the town of Bucha in the northwest of Kyiv. The Security Council, by extension, the world to see and people back then for something to be done. And yet here we are again 6 months on, with James Cleverly, the new British Foreign Secretary, reading out harrowing testimony that the British Foreign Office obtained from Ukrainians who say they have been subjected to torture by Russian soldiers. These incidentally are stories that are not remotely unusual. What we saw in Bucha a few months back has now been repeated in other towns to the east of Russia without we have seen the same sorting atrocities taking place. And we learned today from the prosecutor, chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, who himself and his teams have been to Ukraine and have been investigating what is taking place. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who turned up just before his own speech and left immediately afterwards, didn't have the time to be able to wait and listen to anyone else's speeches. We heard an awful lot he was saying. We heard from Bautism as well. He was suggesting that many of the crimes that have taken place going back to 2014 first started have in fact been Ukrainian war crimes. Let's say the ICC and the UN have said repeatedly they investigate all war crimes, and if there have been cases of war crimes carried out by Ukrainian soldiers, they too be investigated. So it's also like Zaporizhzhia in various parts of Ukraine, which will be shared with associated West, which means that Russia will then be able to claim those territories as part of its own, which then means that it can then say that Ukraine is attacking Russian sovereignty territory, and then if we take this face value, that means he can use whatever weapons he has at his disposal to defend and to create a protective defense of his own land. It's very worrying. Hi, Stephanie. We're in the middle of a line. We must stand up for the line. Do you support Mexico's free trade?
Putting Russia's accountability that you mentioned during your speech?
Well, I think the United Nations as an organization is making an important contribution to resolving problems created by the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And of course, the Black Sea grain corridor is the most evident example of it. The issue where we are still having a discussion, not with the United Nations as an organization, but with some of its members, is the creation of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression. This is mostly, predominantly a discussion between us and the International Criminal Court, how to strike a balance between the mandate of the ICC and the need to bring Russia to account for the crime of aggression. I want everyone to understand one simple thing. Even we do not put in question the integrity of ICC and its willingness to deliver justice, but for legal reasons, it's not feasible to try Russia for the crime of aggression at the ICC. This is the only reason why we are pursuing a different solution. If we have to choose between the ICC and justice, we have to choose justice and find a format which will allow us to try Russia for the crime of aggression. I'm going to see Karim Khan in a couple of minutes. We engage constructively with them and other countries to find a solution.
Why is no one meeting with the Russians? Why is no one meeting with the Russians?
I'm going to see Mexican foreign minister in the afternoon, and we will discuss the proposal.
You mentioned the NATO. You mentioned that you're waiting also to join NATO.
I think NATO is now willing to join Ukraine.
Why is no one meeting with the Russians this week? Or weren't you?
President Putin made it clear. He wants to hold shame referendums. He announced mobilization. He threatened the world with nuclear weapons. Minister Lavrov today was very outspoken, and he reiterated all the propaganda, all the positions of President Putin. So why seeing them? Their position is clear. They chose war. They're not seeking peace. They want to continue with war. They will pay for it.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Okay? That okay? Good morning. I've just addressed the United Nations Security Council for one of its most important meetings this year. We live in a dangerous world. One permanent member of the United Nations Security Council is breaching the most fundamental pillar of the international rules-based order, United Nations Charter. President Putin has announced a partial mobilization in Russia, the organization of illegal referenda in the Ukrainian territories, which are currently occupied by Russia, are threatened again in an unveiled manner with the use of weapons of mass destruction. These actions, this Russia's action, continue threatening peace and security not only in Ukraine but in Europe and elsewhere, and is having severe global consequences in the form of increased food security and rising energy prices. And the world leaders gathered here must be united in condemning this. This is an irresponsible and cynical attempt to undermine the steadfast support to Ukraine. We have shown total disregard for the values of the United Nations. Yes, this is the way it is. President Putin is acting showing complete disregard for the values of the United Nations, and this chamber, as the world community, has to be united to refuse it and to work for peace and progress. Now, President Putin wants to extend further the cost of war and also to the Russian population through this partial mobilization. One thing is clear, Putin wants to destroy Ukraine, and he is not succeeding militarily. Russia has brought immense suffering upon the Ukrainian people. Every day we learn about atrocities committed by the Russian troops. These are tragic stories of broken families who will never see again their loved ones. I witnessed it myself, exhumation of the bodies of the killed people in Bucha when I traveled to Ukraine last April. We have seen the account from Mariupol where people were purposely starved, and now the latest image from Izium area are another demonstration of Russia's complete disregard of any international norms principle. Let me clear that Russia, its political leadership, and all those who are involved in violation of international law and international humanitarian law in Ukraine will be held accountable. The International Criminal Court can count on the European Union's unwavering support. We are supporting the ICC financially and technically, and assisting the Office of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General by providing training, expertise, and equipment, including in collective evidence. Russia must respect the principles of the United Nations Charter and to reverse these illegal plans. As President Zelensky said yesterday here at UNGA, Putin is the only one who wants war. This war is his war. Russia jeopardizes in an unprecedented scale international peace and security. But they will not shake our determination, our resolve and unity to stand by Ukraine, and our comprehensive support to Ukraine's ability to defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty as long as it takes. And the most important thing, all leaders gathered here, the international community, sitting at the United Nations, has to issue a strong condemnation of the threat to use nuclear arms, which is an irresponsible and dangerous position taken by President Putin. We stand by Ukraine.
Do you support Mexico's peace plan? Just a quick question. You said that the Kremlin wants to destroy Ukraine. Do you think Sergei Lavrov is welcome in the Security Council chamber? Do you think he's welcome at the meetings happening around New York? I know you're not meeting with him.
Which is the question?
So the question is should he be welcomed here in this? If his country is trying to destroy Ukraine, do you think he has a role to play here? He just gave his remarks and walked out.
Russia is a member of the United Nations. He has the right to attend the meetings.
Hi, Michelle Kellerman, NPR. Just to follow up on that, what did you make of Lavrov's comments? It seems like this international condemnation. You can't hear?
No.
I'm sorry.
I cannot hear, I cannot understand.
I'll do louder. I just with the microphone, I don't want to screw up that. What do you make of Lavrov's comments? And it seems like international condemnation doesn't move the Russians. Is there anything concrete that the EU is going to do about these annexation plans?
Concrete? You mean concrete? Yeah. Look, since the beginning of the war, we are supporting Ukraine by concrete means, providing military support and arms. It is the first time in our history that we are providing financing for military equipment to a country in war. We have approved a tougher package of sanctions against the Russian economy. And we are developing an intense diplomatic activity in order to explain to the world which are the consequences of this war. These are very concrete things. Sanctions against the Russian economy. We will approve new package of sanctions, although we have already done almost everything possible. We are going to we will continue supporting Ukraine military by providing arms in order for them to defend. And here, the United Nations, and every day, everywhere, we fight the battle of narrative in order to confront the lies of Russia, trying to convince the world that the hunger that they create by blocking the export of Ukrainian grain is the consequences of our sanctions. These are concrete actions.
Last question, Ms. Stampa.
Can you elaborate on what the European Union is ready to do in terms of sanction and military supply to Ukraine, and what will be the reaction if Putin follow through with the threat to use nuclear weapons?
Look, we know that Putin is being pushed to the corner by the success of the Ukrainian military and their counteroffensive. He's in a very dire situation, military. That's why he's calling 300,000 reservists and why he's threatening with nuclear weapons. It's certainly a dangerous situation because we don't know what Putin is able to do. We don't know. He should go to the negotiation table and stop the war. But what we see is that he continues bombing Ukraine and he's continuing escalating in the war. So the Council will study a new package of sanctions to a new set of individuals. I cannot tell their names now. And I studied tightening the economic sanctions, targeting still more the technological part of our relationship with Russia. By the time being, the sanctions are already very tough and very effective. Almost 2/3 of the Russian civilian planes cannot fly anymore. Just an example. 99% of the Russian factories of cars has stopped. 45% of all technological components come from Europe, and they have stopped also. We have to continue stubbornly, relentless, continue. This is not the moment to weaken our support to Ukraine. This is the moment to continue supporting Ukraine militarily, economically, and diplomatically.
Thank you very much.
Support for its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Though my country's 20% is still occupied by Russia, we do not let this difficult challenge define us. We continue to punch above our weight and contribute to the international community. Since our government came to power in 2012, we have implemented an ambitious reform agenda that brought us closer to our key international partners: the European Union, United States, NATO, and the United Nations. For the first time since we regained independence, Georgia and Georgian people has enjoyed an unprecedented decade of peace, prosperity, and stability. We are continuously working on Georgia's global positioning and are already realizing the rewards. According to the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, Georgia is first in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The Open Budget Index ranked Georgia as first in the world in terms of budget transparency. And according to the Fraser Institute, Economic Freedom of the World 2021, Georgia is among the top 5 economies, along with Singapore and Switzerland. Numbeo named Georgia one of the world's safest countries, ranking 14th globally. Our work to align more closely with the United States and Europe goes hand in hand with our commitment to continue democratic transformation. Increased Euro-Atlantic and European integration is our way of returning to the family of European nations, with whom we share history, culture, and most importantly, values. We are continuing our unequivocal path towards European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And our commitment to these goals is backed up by actions and real results, including the Association Agreement, DCFTA, and visa-free travel with the European Union. This year, we applied for full EU membership. The historic decision of the European Council to give us a European perspective create a new set of benchmarks. Just as in the past, Georgia will meet and exceed those benchmarks. The prospect of acceding to the EU is a strong motivation for our country and our citizens. We are fully aware that European perspective comes with a responsibility of the highest political, economic, and legal convergence with the European Union. Georgia immediately responded to the European Council's decision by presenting a very concrete action plan to address the EU's 12 priorities. This inclusive process ensures full engagement of all branches of government, the opposition parties, and civil society. The working groups have been established in Parliament for each priority area with all relevant stakeholders. We're making progress and are well ahead of schedule. Let me be clear. Georgia deserves EU candidate status, which will bring us to eventual membership and make the dream of generations a reality. We have developed a long-term development strategy, Vision 2030, a nationwide policy document that covers key directives and priorities of our general development by 2030 that fully complies with the Sustainable Development Agenda of the United Nations. The country now has a new national strategy for human rights protection for the years 2022-2030. The government approved this strategy following discussions with both international partners and domestic civil society organizations. And this strategy aims to further improve human rights protection standards and is in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This comprehensive document covers all fundamental human rights and freedoms. We are working now with the world's leading firms and brightest minds to transform Georgia into a true multidimensional regional hub. Our financial services sector is globally recognized, and now we are attracting international investors, injecting additional investments in the education and healthcare sectors. The startup ecosystem is thriving. Logistics and energy potential are now realized. Collectively, this created a sustainable and predictable economy for Georgia and its people. Our government's sound policies led to a strong recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, with strong economic growth reaching 10.4% last year in 2021, and now far exceeding expectations from January to July 2022 at 10.3%. According to the IMF, our growth projections are up to 9% for this year, primarily due to our government's proactive measures to minimize the impacts of a post-COVID recovery and the war in Ukraine. We are creating opportunities and giving all the necessary tools to our citizens, including those living in Georgia's occupied territories. For that reason, here today at the United Nations General Assembly, I want to speak directly to my Abkhaz and Ossetian brothers and sisters, and once again tell them that our strength is in unity. And we will build Georgia together and peacefully turn it into a prosperous, free, and unified European state. War is waging again, not far from the doorstep of my country. Russia's full-fledged war in Ukraine undermines Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, as well as the UN Charter and fundamental principles of international law. Georgia stands with Ukraine. Since the start of the war, my government has provided substantial humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, including the allocation of more than 1,000 tons of humanitarian aid. Georgia provides financial assistance and accommodation to over 32,000 Ukrainians currently residing in my country. The Georgian education system has enrolled more than 1,500 Ukrainian students, many of whom receive general education in the Ukrainian language, according to the standard Ukrainian curricula. We have sponsored, joined, or supported almost 400 resolution statements, joint statements, and other initiatives made or proposed by all major international organization institutions in support of Ukraine, including being a main sponsor of the UNGA 76 resolution on the humanitarian consequences of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. As confirmed by the US State Department's report on the investment climate in Georgia, the National Bank of Georgia and Georgian financial institutions act fully in accordance with the financial sanctions imposed by the United States and others on the Russian Federation. We have aligned with the restrictive measures of the EU against Crimea and Sevastopol since 2014, and this year with restrictive measures on Donetsk and Luhansk. As the conflict in Ukraine has shown, the wider Black Sea security is at the forefront of the Euro-Atlantic security agenda. And Georgia, as an indivisible part of the regional architecture, is ready to increase our contribution to common security. As we know well, security brings stability, and stability brings predictability. Predictability is a crucial precondition for sustainable economic development. Therefore, the more predictable the Black Sea region becomes, the more we can unlock its economic potential for the benefit of our people and the global economy. For that reason, we are developing strategic transport corridors connecting Asia with Europe. Georgia participates in several international initiatives and infrastructure projects with our European colleagues to improve connectivity and facilitate reliable and efficient commerce across the Black Sea. Despite the complex situation in our region, we spare no effort to foster rapprochement between our neighbors. We have already had success stories, including the safe return of 15 Armenian detainees to their homeland in exchange for maps of mine territories to Azerbaijan. And this July, for the first time, the foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia met in Tbilisi, Georgia. We are ready to serve as a venue for this dialogue to bring much-needed peace and stability to our region. And with this in mind, Georgia has been promoting the Peaceful Neighborhood Initiative, which envisions participation by all three states of the South Caucasus. This new initiative, dear friends, is not substituting, countering, or opposing any other cooperation formats. Georgia serves as an honest broker to aid in normalizing regional relations. We're also heavily investing in our country's infrastructure to increase Georgian transit capabilities for the benefit of the region. We aim to attract greater institutional foreign investment, facilitate projects of regional importance, and strengthen our infrastructural capabilities, thus becoming an actual bridge between East and West. And our goal is to transform the South Caucasus into a region of opportunities and economic growth. We are already discussing with our EU counterparts a list of flagship projects which will bring additional economic synergies and serve as catalyst for more connectivity and integration with the European Union and European markets. We believe all countries of the South Caucasus and allies from the West will benefit from this collaboration. We must act now to secure the Black Sea, protect energy routes, maintain supply chains, and increase regional connectivity to foster greater economic development. These are all essential to European peace and prosperity. We are mindful that our regional challenges are happening against a backdrop of global challenges, such as international security, the pandemic, and climate change. Georgia contributes to global peace and the rules-based international order. For over 2 decades, Georgia has contributed to NATO missions around the world, serving as one of the largest per capita contributors to the mission in Afghanistan. And we lost many brave soldiers. Hundreds were wounded in these missions and suffered significant casualties. Georgia reiterates its readiness to stand by NATO in protecting common security, while continuing to support the EU-led missions. Dear friends, as I speak here today, dangers are threatening all of humanity that we can no longer ignore. The planetary crisis created by climate change, from biodiversity loss to pollution, represent an existential threat. Like many challenges, it affects developing nations first, hindering the ability to realize sustainable development goals. In Georgia, our government has made significant investments in education, public health, and the environment to ensure that future generations can thrive. Education systems are critical for empowering prosperous and productive societies. Education in the 21st century means investing in digital literacy and promoting infrastructure to bridge the digital divide to ensure that future crises, whether public health, war, or climate related, do not create dire situations. In conclusion, I believe that working together, we will return peace and prosperity to our homes and countries. This is the spirit and the mandate vested in the United Nations from its founding.